Thanks for joining me in what proves to be a fun, interesting adventure here. So I graduated in 2001. I was sad to do the math on that last night. Um, I went and spent a couple of years in industry. I worked at NASCO shipyard out in San Diego as a systems engineer, project engineer. Quit my job, went back to school full time to get my Ph.D. in risk and reliability engineering and management from Vanderbilt University. Decided after that I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Got a job as a faculty member at Old Dominion University in their engineering management systems engineering department. Taught there for 10 years. Switched to UNC Asheville 3 years ago, and I've been teaching in the management department there. And so over the course of my 13 years in academia, as well as my couple of years in industry, consulting, research, teaching, and so on, it's all focused around this idea of systems thinking and decision making and sort of the intersection between those two. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, systemic thinking, a path to improved problem understanding. Oh, let's see here. Okay. So you've no doubt heard the phrase think globally, act locally. So I reached out to give this talk. This is something that I've given variations of before. And ironically, in thinking about it, preparing it, and reviewing it over the weekend, I thought, well, maybe it's more appropriate now than perhaps when I presented it in the past. And you'll see some of the examples I'll include. I promise I did not just come up with them. I've had them sitting here. So we'll see that they make a lot of sense in the context of the sorts of things that we are facing as a country as well as a world. So you've no doubt heard the phrase, think globally, act locally. And you may have heard it in advertising, or you may have heard it sort of from sociologists or anthropologists or folks that you maybe don't encounter on a routine basis as an engineer, but it's sort of floating around in the ether inside your brain. And if you think about what it means to you, if it means anything at all, at least for me, it sort of means this. So this is just a snapshot from a climate change related infographic where they're talking about global warming. And it's this idea that, and certainly we're facing a similar phenomenon right now when we're talking about the coronavirus, is, well, we have to think about the global ramifications of the decisions that we make, but I can't make global decisions as an individual or as an organization. I have to make local decisions. And so if I'm saying to myself, global warming or climate change, global climate change is something that I'm concerned with, I can't simply say, all right, let me solve that problem overnight from a global perspective. What I can do is make my own individual contributions. And so I may decide to bike to work or walk to work, or in today's environment, I may decide, or it's been decided for me, to work remotely, for example. And so in the context of COVID-19, we're seeing that when people are talking about, I can't convince everyone to stay at home. I can't convince everyone to socially distance or to self-isolate, but I can make that decision for myself as an individual. I can reach out to my sphere of influence. Maybe it's my colleagues, my friends, my family, and so on. And I can help them make that decision. But the difficulty is where we bridge the gap between our localized or individualized decision-making and sort of the global ramifications of that. So how do we convince people that the decisions that we make on an individualized basis have the potential to have that ripple effect to change things on a larger scale? Again, we're facing this currently because we're trying to convince people that they should socially isolate themselves, or they should distance themselves, they should self-quarantine, they should stay at home, other than for essential activities like going to the doctor, let's say. But if you do that, and all of your friends and all of your relatives do that, but other folks don't, and they're still spreading, potentially spreading a virus, for example, then that's where the difficulty comes into play. So again, very appropriate, I think, to what we're facing as a society, as a world right now. But we have this nagging nature of complex problems. And if you can think about a problem that keeps you up at night, try to think of one even besides the coronavirus, one that really eats at you. That's easy. We have them in our professional lives, we have them in our personal lives, we have all sorts of things that we're facing that we're trying to wrap our head around and trying to make some traction on. And you've no doubt have several, whether you're an undergraduate student, whether you're an individual that's been in industry for decades, you're facing complicated problems, irrespective of our global situation that we have going on right now. And so work, home, life, etc., we're facing a number of different, very complex problems. And the question you might ask yourself if you're saying, okay, well, why? Why haven't I been able to wrap my head around this and fix it or solve it or correct it? What really makes it hard? So if I sort of zoom out a little bit and look at what's going on in the world, we are facing lots of massive problems. In the upper left-hand corner, we have world hunger or poverty. And if you think about that, it depends on the perspective that you're taking on it. If you say right now, I go to my pantry and it's full, and my fridge and it's full, and I have food to make, and I don't go hungry every night when I go to sleep, you maybe aren't facing that problem. But we're seeing this phenomena right now with people, for example, being accused of hoarding materials that they don't need in advance of the possible situations that they think they may be facing in the coming weeks, for example. So it's about how you view that particular problem. Or you may think about it in the context of genetically modified crops, for example. Some people may have philosophical opposition to genetically modified crops, and so they say, I don't want to eat those. And other people who say, I haven't had a meal in weeks, I don't care how you made it, just give it to me. I'm starving, I need access to that food. And so how you face that problem or how you encounter it shapes whether or not you even believe that a problem exists, for example. On the upper right-hand side, we have education. As a student at Webb, you have a very unique perspective on education in terms of the value that a very rigorous engineering education brings to you post-graduation. It gives you lots of opportunities, gives you lots of circumstances that you can go into graduate school, you can go into the workforce, you can start your own business, and so on. When you signed up, wherever you are in your educational career, you signed up for in-person classes. Right now, we're all transitioning to online classroom environments. So how do we make that transition? If you're at a university that's already online, you see this as business as usual. And so you get up Monday morning and you go to class just the same as you would any other day. If you're used to an in-person environment and you're saying, this is totally different than what I thought I was signing up for, it may be a very difficult adjustment period for you. And so the idea of how we adjust to that problem and whether or not we even see it as a problem is all about in the eye of the beholder. And so you might not see a problem, or you may see this as an exciting opportunity to go to class in your pajamas, for example. The bottom left-hand corner is a picture of my old neighborhood in Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, Virginia is one of the hardest hit cities in America in terms of climate change, in terms of the exposure that it is getting to rising sea levels and so on. And I find this a fascinating problem. So if we think about it in the context of engineering, we think about it in the context of defense, you may say, I don't live in Hampton Roads, I don't live in Norfolk, I don't live anywhere close to there, so why am I concerned with the fact that climate change has led to rising sea levels and has led to more recurrent flooding? Well, I went to a talk by John Kerry, Secretary of State, when he was Secretary of State a few years ago, at Old Dominion University, which is my previous institution. And he talked about climate change and access. Naval Station Norfolk is in Norfolk. It's the world's largest Navy base. And so if you can't get access to Naval Station Norfolk because the roads are flooded, which frequently happens and is happening with increasing probability and increasing severity, so it happens more often and worse every time we have even just moderate rain there, then it becomes a national defense problem. And so you may say, well, I don't live anywhere close to there. It's not my concern. It doesn't matter to me. Well, it should, because it should matter to you how folks can gain access to that base in an effort to support national defense and in order to support military readiness, for example. And so it's all about how I view that problem and whether or not I view it as a climate change problem, I view it as a defense problem, I view it as how we as a society or as a global constituency are contributing to the negative effects of climate change, for example, and what we can do about it, or what we should do about it, for example, in the context of that think globally, act locally example that I gave earlier. And of course, we're all familiar with the bottom right-hand corner there, our friend COVID-19, the graphic that you've seen floating around everywhere on Facebook and Twitter and every website that you've been reading over the last couple of weeks. And again, interesting, one of my Webb classmates lives in West Virginia, and she was talking about it up until a couple of days ago. West Virginia was the only state in the United States that had not had a confirmed case. And some folks almost wore that as a badge of honor. And she said, well, the interesting thing about it is it's not that we don't have it here, it's that we actually have done so little testing that we haven't shown any positives. And so it's highly unlikely we don't have anyone with COVID-19. It's more that we've not actually done the testing required to show that people actually have it here. So depending on your perspective, you may actually see that as a really big problem, which is that we're walking among people who are probably infected with this virus, and yet we're treating it as though we should be proud of ourselves because no one's infected, whereas the reality is we probably are, or someone is, and yet we don't know about it. And so how I tackle this problem, how I attempt to view it, and how I think it's relevant to me as an individual, as a society, as a global pandemic, as we're facing right now, all comes from the lens that I place on it, the way in which I approach a particular problem. So this is the part that I said, I promise you I actually had this example. This is one I did a few years ago. And it's pretty relevant to what we're facing as a world today. The Ebola virus disease. The Ebola virus disease is certainly a complex problem. The last I looked at it, we were at just about 29,000 reported cases. Since March 2014, there were 11,315 people that died from Ebola in Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. The US had only a couple people, and Mali. So January 13th, 2016, the World Health Organization declared the last affected country, Liberia, Ebola-free. We sort of saw a little bit of flare-up, perhaps, in Ebola when we thought it was gone, and we're still trying to face that. Not nearly the scale that we're facing currently with COVID-19, but I'll come back to this idea of Ebola in a handful of slides and talk about how we might view it and what it means to us in terms of sort of peeling the onion back and looking at it from a higher level perspective, and how we might try to do something about it if we are faced with being affected by this problem. Or again, obviously we can draw the parallels to what we're currently facing with coronavirus. So what does it mean at the end of the day? Well, whether we're talking about poverty, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about pandemics, problems are getting what we might generically call more complex, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And so what does a complex problem mean? Well, there's uncertainty surrounding the problem itself and its formulation and bounding. So what's in the bucket, what's outside of the bucket, what pertains to us, what doesn't, what does this problem actually look like, what doesn't it look like? Let's say that, for example, you go on, you graduate, and you move on to be a naval architect to work at a firm that primarily focuses on Department of Defense assets. So if you're helping to design a particular subset of that particular system that feeds into the DoD complex, well, it's not just about the capabilities that you're providing for that particular ship, let's say, but it's about how does that fit into the overall structure of the Department of Defense? How can that help the DoD complete its mission? And so where do we draw the bounds? What's our problem? What do we have to try to tackle? And what isn't our problem? What pertains to someone else, for example, or what exists outside of our bubble? Not surprisingly, because we are sort of widening our aperture, there's multiple perspectives on the problems that we are facing, and they don't all agree. You may have seen some argument about whether or not we are facing what would be called a pandemic right now. People say, "Oh no, it's not really a pandemic." You know, it's being blown out of proportion. It should really be referred to as an epidemic and not have the same global reach that we would perhaps ascribe to calling COVID-19 a pandemic. It seems maybe perhaps we're coalescing around the agreement that it is at this point a full-blown pandemic. But the other issue that comes up is that the problem is subject to emergent conditions, which means what we know today isn't necessarily what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day and so on. So right now, scientists are arguing about whether or not growth of COVID-19 follows a power law distribution or an exponential distribution. We're trying to figure that out. Why that matters, because it matters how quickly we would expect this disease to propagate, and therefore how quickly we need to take corrective action, for example. And so not knowing what's going to happen, it's easy to say what already happened, because we can look at historical information, we can fit curves to historical information, we can try to look at understanding what's already occurred, but trying to predict what happens in the future, that's really where the complexity comes into play. Where we have emergent conditions. So I've seen research that talks about, for example, that some individuals think that warmer weather and humidity helps to tackle COVID-19. I've seen other research that says that indicators like loss of sense of smell help individuals to diagnose whether or not you've been exposed to this particular virus and so on. So because there's so many emergent conditions, because things are changing daily or hourly, it's really, really complicated to try to figure out how we even wrap our head around what this is so that we can attempt to move forward. And decisions don't exist in a bubble, right? They're part of a set of beliefs and a worldview that derive from our perspectives on the problem. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, we're seeing this right now in argument in the United States over what we should do with a stimulus package to sort of reinvigorate the economy. Should we be business-centric? Should we be individual-centric? Should we give individual stimulus checks to people to help spur economic activity? Should we give it to corporations? We see different perspectives on that. If I give an individual person a check, will that money be reinvested in the economy in some capacity? If I give a corporation a tax break or some other form of a bailout, will that trickle down in a way that is advantageous for our economy? And so it's important that we understand both the decision environment, the stakeholders associated with it, the context, the timing of it, et cetera, and the decision itself. So it's not just that decision, it's everything that wraps around it. So when I did look at complex problems, I don't want you to digest the whole thing here, but we have heard them throughout literature be called a number of different things. Ill-structured problems, you may have heard of wicked problems, practical problems, swamps, messes. Sean refers to them, and I like this quote because he refers to them as in the context of a swamp. And I really like this because as an engineer, my undergraduate training, and many of you that are at Webb, your undergraduate training was largely in this technical side. And so you see there in first, we have this idea of the high hard ground that Sean talks about. And so it's this sort of technical piece that we need to get our foot in the door. But then he talks about the other side, which is the swampy lowland. And I like that visual of this idea of sort of in the muck, getting your hands dirty, really trying to wrap your head around these nasty problems that are intractable and really complicated. And so Sean talks about the difficulty of the problems of the high ground. They're greatly interesting in terms of their technical capabilities, but they're often relatively unimportant to clients or the larger society. While in the swamp are the problems of the greatest human concern. And so it's, again, this duality of we have sort of the technical solution, but we can't consider the technical solution to a problem in isolation from the mucky human reality of how we actually deploy that. Simple example is quarantines. We know that a 2-week quarantine, if we were somehow magically able to isolate every single person for 2 weeks, that would help significantly erase COVID-19. But it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of the swampiness associated with the realities. Well, we have practical considerations like we need law enforcement and medical personnel that have to interact with other individuals. we also have human-centric circumstances where people basically say, I may not be in a risk category, or I'm not willing to isolate, or for whatever reason, I want to get out and interact with other people, or it doesn't affect me because I'm not, thinking I'm going to get sick, for example. That's the really fun part for me, is the interesting piece of, okay, well, we have the solution, the technical answer, but how do we integrate that with the nasty, ugly, messy, swampy side? And that interaction is where complex problems reside, and where I've spent the better part of my career playing. So if we sort of peel that onion back a little bit, we see a problem right there in the middle, and it interacts with a number of different factors. And so if you were writing an essay in middle school, you would have been asked to address who, what, why, where, when, and how. When we're trying to tackle a really complex problem, the same thing resides here. We have the same questions. And so we want to look at the stakeholders associated with our problem. Who's affiliated with it? What is their relative interaction with one another? Are there authority figures? Do they have the ability to make other people do what they want? For example, can they issue mandatory quarantines? If you're talking about a sponsor for a project, can they cut off funding? Can they establish requirements, and so on? Those stakeholders require motivation. And so the motivation is the why piece. Why are they involved? Do they have a financial stake? Do they have a moral stake, an ethical stake? Do they have an interest? If they're a competitor against your organization, they obviously have an interest in what you're doing because they want to see you fail. That motivation is necessary to address problems, because research shows that in the absence of motivation, we don't get anything done. And so we find actually that intrinsic motivation is a much greater driver for individuals than extrinsic motivation. And if we can establish associated appropriate intrinsic motivation for individuals, and specifically if we can align that with organizational motivation, then our organization will be much more successful. Our stakeholders also have to instantiate, which means they do things. They instantiate means. And so they go get research, they build the systems, they build the ships that we are designing. They stay at home as part of their quarantine. They go get information. They distribute and disseminate logic amongst themselves, and so on. So they interact with our system. They do that to achieve the what, or the ends that we are trying to achieve. So if we have a problem and we decompose it sort of into, and you think about this in a systems engineering or requirements perspective, we decompose a problem or a problem statement into a number of requirements. Those can be associated with some fundamental objectives, for example, and those are the things we're trying to achieve by solving our problem. And so we do things, those stakeholders, in our system to successfully resolve problems. We also have to worry about timing. So timing concerns, this is an issue right now that we're facing with the coronavirus, is when do we establish restrictive measures where individuals have to stay at home, or they have particular restrictions in place? And if you look, the United States, being sort of a loose federation of 50 states, is really fascinating, because the different states are doing fundamentally different things. And it's fascinating to see when they're choosing to time their interventions, when they're telling people to stay home, or when they're telling people it's okay to sort of continue business as usual. Certain schools, I think Kansas, called K through 12 education for the entire year in advance of every other state in the country. They said, we're not going to meet again. We know it. If your kids are in school here, be prepared to set up for the long haul. They're going to be homeschooled for the rest of the school year. And so thinking about timing and when we intervene, or when we collect more information and then choose to intervene, is a really tricky piece of this entire puzzle. And then finally, we have context. And context has to do with things like the boundaries of our system. It has to do with norms and values. One of the things that we hold very strongly to in America is sort of this individual notion of freedom. And so it's very difficult when we establish federal or even local guidelines associated with the restrictions of those freedoms. We have an immediate pushback from the populace who says, you can't tell me what to do. You can't make me do this. But there's obviously reasons for trying to put those behaviors in place. And so at the end of the day, that all ties back to problems. That's where it all comes from. And so we have to determine what is or what are our problems. So Andy Sage, who's a noted systems, or was a noted systems engineer, I like his quote about a problem. It's an undesirable situation or unresolved matter that's significant to some individual or group, and that the individual or group is desirous of resolving. What does that mean? It means that one or a number of people don't like where we are and we want to get to a better place. Or the last bullet there, I like this way to describe it. It represents a delta between your current desired state that someone wishes to address. Or the way I like to say it is, there's a delta between where I am and where I want to be. So you say, okay, well, that sounds pretty easy, right? I know where I am and I know where I want to be. I'm not a millionaire and I want to be a millionaire, so let's make that happen, right? Well, it's not quite that easy. And so you see a couple things there in red. Sometimes we have an argument on whether or not there even is a problem. So folks who say, oh, there's no pandemic, or there's no issue with this particular capability. We don't have a capability gap, for example. And so if I'm arguing with somebody who doesn't see that there's a problem to begin with, I'm going to have a really difficult time on that second part, which is what the problem is. If they say, no, I'm not facing an issue. Again, my pantry's stocked. I'm not facing a poverty issue or a hunger issue. And say, yeah, but other people are. So you need to understand that that problem exists perhaps outside of your immediate bubble. So Venix's quote there at the end I really like. There are no objective problems, only situations defined as problems by people. And I think that's really true. It's not about objectively whether or not something exists, but it's about how we define it, how we articulate it, and what it means to us in a way that allows us to do something about it, for example. So someone may say, if I never plan on visiting an Ebola ravaged area, is it a problem to me? Well, it depends on my perspective. Maybe I have a financial interest in that area. Maybe I have a humanitarian interest, a moral or ethical interest in making sure that Ebola goes away, or in this case, COVID-19 goes away. So the importance of how much time we want to spend on problem identification obviously matters based on what we're facing. So if we have stomach pains or dinner choice or something, well, they both meet our earlier definition of a delta between where I am and where I want to be. And so if I don't consider the fact, I don't understand the fact that it exists within a larger system, then I'm going to fail. So just because no person exists as an island, no problem exists in isolation. So, okay, I have stomach pains, but I know that right now all the emergency rooms, all the doctors are taking care of potential coronavirus patients. So I'm probably not going to go to the doctor unless I am just dying. I think I have appendicitis. I need immediate help, for example. So it's not just about my individual problem, but how it fits into a larger context. Same thing with dinner, for example. Right now, we're facing a very interesting dinner problem, right? I want to go out to dinner. Well, I can't because every single restaurant is closed. And so I have to get takeout or I stay at home. And if I get takeout, then I'm considering interacting with other people, and there may be additional concerns with that. So the first step to doing something about a problem is articulating it as best as possible. And so I love this quote. It comes from Keeney and Reifar are decision analysis faculty. They've been doing this forever and ever. And they teamed up with Hammond, who's sort of on the practical side. And so they wrote they wrote a book called Smart Choices, which is really just kind of like a pocket guide about decision making. And they talk about this idea of problem structuring. Though they may feel they're making progress in solving their problem, to us they seem like travelers barreling along a highway, satisfied to be going 60 miles an hour without realizing they're going the wrong way. I love this image because I picture myself standing on the side of the highway waving to these people as they're barreling down the wrong direction on the interstate. Just because you're making progress or seemingly making progress doesn't mean you're actually moving in the right direction. And so we don't want to go into a problem with an answer already in mind, because otherwise we don't actually face a problem in the context of what we're talking about. We're really talking about execution. If I already know the answer, then there isn't really a problem for me to solve. It's simply me to say, let's go make this happen, which is a different problem. And this all comes from the idea of what we're trying to do here, which is to avoid what's called the type 3 error. So Mitrov spends a decent amount of time on this. In your studies, you've heard probably of the type 1 and type 2 error in terms of statistical hypothesis testing. But the type 3 error is solving the wrong problem precisely. And so it's this idea that we did a really good job addressing the problem. The issue is that it wasn't the correct problem. And so The example that I usually give is you go to the doctor, the physician listens to your symptoms, prescribes the improper treatment because he or she did not conduct a proper examination. And so you need to get more detail, you need to dig deeper, and you need to get more information. So your client comes to you and says, this is what I want addressed. And you don't just say, okay, I'm good with that. You say, well, tell me more about it. I need to dig into it more. Can you help me understand it more? You maybe go gather empirical data. You take observations. You observe their operations, for example, to really get to the core of the issue, so that you can then progress in the right direction. So you're not standing on the side of the highway waving to people going southbound when they should have been going northbound. So once we've got the right problem, how do we actually do something about it? Well, I like this example. It comes from the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? I like this little comic. And they basically say, we could all relate probably right now with this. My life is so overwhelming right now. I have so much to do. I can't wrap my head around it. And they happen to say, and I can't even find a bite of the elephant that tastes good. So how do I wrap my head around a really complicated problem? You maybe have heard of this. It's an old story, the blind man and the elephant, as it's typically told. And so you have 6 individuals, they're blindfolded, they're brought up to an elephant and exposed to a particular part of that elephant without knowing what everyone else is up to. And so the one individual feels the ear and says it's a fan, the other individual feels the tusk and says it's a spear, the one feels the trunk and says it's a snake, and the leg and says it's a tree, and the stomach and says it's a wall, and the tail and says it's a rope. And given what they know, they're all right. But we have this thing called complementarity. And complementarity says, well, everybody on the previous slide has their own perspective on what the elephant is or what the problem is that they've been exposed to. Each, based on their own experience, is right, and yet none of them is entirely correct or complete. And so complementarity says that everyone brings a value-added perspective to a particular problem. We need to gather those perspectives to get a complete understanding of a complicated problem, to really capture, in this case, the essence of the elephant, or the essence of healthcare, or if you're, again, designing, let's say, a vessel for the Department of Defense, you want to go talk to operators, you want to go talk to the customer, you want to go talk to other folks so that you get a more complete picture of what it means to interact with that system. It's the whole reason why at Webb, during your freshman winter work, you go work in industry so that you get, you go work in a shipyard, you get your hands dirty. So you have that complementary perspective to later on in your career when you become, an engineer, when you become a naval architect, and then you want to recognize that there are different perspectives brought to that problem because you've been exposed to how different people view that world. And so what it means at the end of the day is there's numerous ways we can look at a problem. No one perspective is complete or correct. And so this actually comes from physics. Niels Bohr did some physics experiments and came up with this idea of complementarity. Sort of the way you view an experiment and the observations that you take about an experiment yield a different set of insights for you. And so you can learn differently depending on how you view a particular problem. So we go talk to people on the machine shop floor. They're going to have a different perspective than the shareholders, and they're going to have a different perspective than line management or the CEO, for example. But those are all valuable perspectives that we want to understand when we're trying to tackle these big, ugly, nasty problems. And so the place I like to play and the place that I've spent the better part of my career at is in that red spot in the middle. So as engineers, we are taught and we learn and we spend a lot of time on the left-hand side in that hard perspective. We learn differential equations and calculus and all sorts of statics and dynamics and so on. We learn a lot of hard perspectives, a lot of technical information, and we're incredibly, fantastically, mathematically competent. And then I think, or at least in my experience, then as I got into industry and as I got exposed to real problems, I learned a lot more about the stuff on the right. Organizational concerns, managerial concerns, political, policy, human factors, the stuff that sort of makes our really sophisticated mathematical models bend, at least a little bit. Hopefully not break, but exposes them to new constraints that maybe we didn't fully capture when we were thinking about it from the purely technical perspective. And so complex problems really reside at that intersection between our hard and our soft perspective. So you say, okay, well, just go talk to a whole bunch of people. That sounds easy. Well, there's some issues with embracing complementarity. Um, Individuals may be trained in different techniques for solving problems. That may be as simple as one of you may be a marine engineer, one of you is a civil, a structural, and so on. And so they might be aligned in that they're engineering and they have the same mathematical foundations, but they might be different in terms of their fundamental objective for what they're trying to do when encountering a particular problem. Or they may be fundamentally incompatible. And so we've seen this with a number of engineering tragedies throughout history. Something like, excuse me, the Challenger disaster, for example, and we have a fundamental disagreement between engineering and management. And so, management is focused on getting the job done with the most efficient use of resources, perhaps, and engineering is about getting, making sure that it's technically sound and that the solution is the most effective in terms of establishing, meeting customer requirements, for example. Those techniques may be incompatible. They may be marginally incompatible, or they may be fundamentally at odds with one another. And so it's one thing to capture those different perspectives. It's a whole other thing, a whole additional step to then try to take them, if they're orthogonal to one another, and sort of find some middle ground between them. Individuals may not speak the same language, literally or figuratively. Figuratively, again, in the context of, if we talk to someone who's not familiar as an engineer, if we talk to someone about things like optimization, and someone says, like, I don't know what you're trying to do here, this is not a world in which I typically live, then it may be difficult to have a conversation with them in a way that says, if I can just save a little bit in terms of this particular structural entity, I can optimize the overall weight of this vessel. I can cut it down by 10%. And then they may say, well, yeah, I understand that, I guess, but I'm trying to do this other thing. And so recognizing how different people approach the same problem and how they may have figurative language barriers in terms of how they understand and evaluate the goodness of a particular solution. And so because of that, they may have differing viewpoints on how to address a problem, what the problem is, or we go back to Venix, or if there even is a problem. I say, no, this is my answer. But your answer is incompatible with what I'm doing. Yeah, but this is what I have, let's say. So how do we break through these barriers? Well, we build a model. And a model, the way we define, or the way I define a model, it's a purposeful abstraction of reality. So you see a couple examples there. The bottom left-hand corner is, a NOAA model, for example, a weather forecasting model. And so when I used to live in coastal Virginia, I followed these a lot when we had hurricane tracking, during hurricane season. On the right-hand side, hopefully you're not following your stock portfolio or any investments you have too closely right now. You might be looking at some model for economic activity in the United States, for example. And so these are different models. These are different representations of weather on the left-hand side, of economic activity on the right-hand side, and they speak across languages. They cross disciplines, for example. So just a little bit of modeling 101. We can use a universal language such as pictures to capture our thoughts. Cognitive mapping is what I often use. And cognitive mapping rests on the mathematical framework of adjacency matrices. And so it's basically just a giant matrix, which says how are different entities, A, B, and C in this case, connected to one another through causal relationships. And so as B increases, that leads to an increase in A, for example. So we can use that sort of representation to try to capture a problem. And so how do we do this in the context of complex problems? Well, we identify a common element to explore to give us a anchor for our cognitive map that we're building for that representation. We sort of divide and conquer. And so we ask ourselves who, what, why, where, when, and how. We sort of make our own representation of this problem. We can then compare our cognitive maps with one another, or we can mathematically combine them because they're just an adjacency matrix, because it's just a big matrix. We can combine them without difficulty. We can then use that conversation to revise, to correct, to adjust. And then the interesting piece is number 5. We construct a narrative to make some sense of it. Why is there a difference? Why are there similarities? What are we seeing? How are we viewing this world in a different way? So I'll go back to my friend, the Ebola virus disease. So this is actually from an analysis I did with a couple of colleagues a few years ago. And what we were actually trying to do was to answer the question, what can be done to reduce the incidence rate of the Ebola virus disease? We wanted to look at economic, healthcare, political ramifications, among a number of other things. And it was me, Ph.D. in engineering. It was a colleague, a doctorate of education, and there was another colleague, global health individual who had an MD. And so very different backgrounds, very different disciplinary upbringings, very different languages, both literal and figurative. One of my colleagues was a native of Turkey. So both literal and figurative barriers in terms of our communication. So this is just a snapshot. I just want to show you. This was my cognitive map. Don't dig too deep into it here. The big piece I want to show you is there's a lot of feedback loops. There's a lot of interaction effects. It's just how my brain works. As an engineer, I think about if this, then this, if that, then this. What are the causal linkages between particular connections? When one thing happens, how does that lead to another? And so on. This is the global health lens. Interestingly enough, when we had our conversation over coffee, hers was the most sparse. And we said, well, we thought you were the expert. And she said, yeah, I'm the expert, which means I know that I know the least about it. Oh, all right then. So you look at hers and compared to mine, for example, and the next one I'll show you in a minute, it's very sparse. There's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of just listing of factors. And she sort of said, I don't really know. And so I think we're seeing that sort of history repeat itself right now in the context of COVID-19, where people are saying, I know these things should factor in, but I don't know exactly how. And so until we collect more data, until we're able to come up with more sophisticated causal models, all I can tell you is that I think that these elements have some implication. And then finally, education. So this was the individual, and you can see this one's very hierarchical. And so just the shape of the graphs shows you enough that mine is very cyclical, the global health one is very sparse, and the educational one is very hierarchical. And so it was interesting to have that conversation about how they decompose a really complicated problem, how they view it, what it means to them. And we sort of zoomed out and tried to make some comparisons. And we saw, for example, infrastructure was a big part of these maps. Travel accessibility and restrictions, access to clean water and healthcare, technology, sewage, electricity. Obviously, a stronger infrastructure places you in an advantage when combating an infectious disease, whether it's COVID-19 or Ebola virus. GDP is a good proxy for a country's financial health, and that was a prominent factor. The richer your country is, at a minimum, it means better access to healthcare, a higher probability of having health insurance, and generally better living conditions, leading to longer life expectancy. So at least means that you have a fighting chance as compared to a country that doesn't have that same infrastructure. Demographics were also important in the context of Ebola, at least in terms of how susceptible you are to contracting and ultimately dying from an infectious disease. We did actually see some interesting diversions. I thought the WHO's involvement was really important. My colleagues did not see that. The global health individual had a list of global health things. I didn't pick those up because that's not my discipline. And the education faculty member said transdisciplinary preparation of people was appropriate, was necessary. And I sort of said, okay, sure. So it was interesting. We came at it from very different backgrounds, very different training and upbringing, but we were able to have a conversation around the same problem using that tool of modeling as a common language. So, excuse me. In order to address a complex problem, you have to zoom out. You have to look and see how does it factor into a larger context, a larger world. But that doesn't mean that you're able to make those wholesale changes at the global level. You're likely only able to act locally or a more localized manner. And so what do we want to do? We want to appreciate that complex problems reside within a larger system. And so when I make a change, it trickles up, if you will. We want to spend deliberate effort on problem structuring to make sure that we all understand that we're on the same page and we've identified the same problem. We want to consider multiple perspectives. So we want to go out and collect those perspectives in the spirit of complementarity and recognize that individuals have value added resources to bring to bear to our particular problem. And then finally, we want to collect that information in a model. And so it may be something like a cognitive map, like I showed. It may be a mathematical model. But understand, as an engineer, we may understand and be very comfortable with mathematical models, whereas someone from another discipline may be less comfortable with those sort of really robust, rigorous mathematical models. And so we didn't want to alienate those individuals from their inclusion into this conversation. And so that's why we may wish to stop at something like a cognitive map, which has mathematics under the hood, but yet has that easy to understand causal representation that someone from a completely different discipline that maybe doesn't have the same rigorous mathematical background can still understand and contribute and be part of the conversation in a way it maybe wouldn't be able to be if we went straight to a Diffie-Hughes model, for example. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions.